In the autumn of 1998, in a peaceful suburb in Indiana, a young woman went missing without warning, and authorities were left with nothing. But 17 years later, a forgotten object revealed the truth, and it uncovered a truth no one was prepared for. The town was located just a few miles outside the bustling city limits of Fort Wayne, Indiana. It was the kind of idyllic, perfectly manicured Midwestern community where neighbors still knew each other by their first names. Children rode their bicycles freely down the wide paved streets, and the changing of the seasons brought a beautiful, familiar comfort to the residents. In the fall, the massive oak and maple trees lining the neighborhood sidewalks exploded into vibrant shades of orange and gold. It was a place designed for settling down, building a quiet life, and eventually raising a family away from the noise of the world. At the very heart of this peaceful suburban dream lived a vibrant, deeply compassionate 26-year-old woman named Leah Carter and her devoted husband, Owen. Leah and Owen were the absolute definition of a perfect match. They had met several years earlier through mutual friends, and their connection had been instantaneous and entirely undeniable. Leah possessed a warm, radiant energy that naturally drew people toward her. She worked as a patient coordinator at a busy local medical clinic, spending her days helping elderly patients navigate their appointments with an endless, genuine patience. Owen was a quiet, steady, and incredibly hardworking logistics manager at a regional shipping company. He was the anchor to her bright energy, a man who looked at his wife with a profound, unshakable adoration. They had been officially married for exactly 6 weeks. Their wedding had been a beautiful, intimate autumn ceremony surrounded by their closest friends and family. Immediately after returning from their brief honeymoon, they had proudly closed on their very first home, a small, charming, single-story house with a wide front porch and a large backyard. They were completely consumed by the chaotic, beautiful joy of a new marriage. They spent their evenings painting the walls of their new living room, assembling furniture, and quietly talking about the children they desperately wanted to have. They rarely spent a single evening apart. Anyone who looked at Leah and Owen Carter completely believed they were witnessing a love story that would easily last for the next 50 years. But that beautiful, flawless future was about to be violently, permanently shattered. It was a completely ordinary Thursday morning in the middle of October. The air was incredibly crisp, carrying the heavy, familiar scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. The morning began exactly like every other day. Owen woke up early, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and sat with Leah at their small kitchen table. They talked briefly about their plans for the upcoming weekend, shared a warm kiss by the front door, and drove away to their respective jobs, entirely unaware that the perfectly safe world they had built was only hours away from complete collapse. Leah arrived at the medical clinic right on time. Her coworkers would later heavily confirm that she seemed completely normal during the early morning hours. She cheerfully greeted the patients, organized the daily filing cabinets, and completed her standard administrative duties. But as the afternoon approached, something deeply imperceptible completely shifted in Leah's demeanor. Shortly after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Leah approached the clinic's senior receptionist, a woman named Maya. Leah was holding her heavy winter coat and her purse. She looked highly distracted, her eyes lacking their usual bright warmth. Leah quietly informed Maya that she needed to leave work a few hours early to take care of a highly personal errand. Maya immediately asked if everything was all right, assuming Leah might be feeling slightly ill. Leah shook her head, offering a small, incredibly tight smile. "I'm fine," Leah told her coworker, her voice carrying a strange, heavy weight. "There's just something I have to tell Owen tonight. I should have told him entirely sooner." Maya simply nodded, wishing her well, and completely assumed Leah was talking about a surprise gift or a minor financial issue. Leah pushed the heavy glass doors of the clinic open, stepped out into the crisp autumn afternoon, walked toward her car and drove away. She absolutely never came home. At exactly 5:30 that evening, Owen pulled his truck into their quiet suburban driveway. He completely expected to see Lee's car parked in the garage. He expected to walk through the front door and smell dinner cooking in the kitchen, or find Lee sitting on the living room floor, unpacking the remaining moving boxes. But the driveway was completely empty. Owen unlocked the front door and stepped into a highly silent, completely dark house. He flipped on the hallway light, calling out his wife's name. There was absolutely no answer. He walked through the kitchen, the bedroom, and the small backyard. Nothing was out of place, but the absolute lack of her presence immediately sent a tiny, cold seed of confusion into his chest. He initially brushed the anxiety away, logically assuming she had simply stopped at the local grocery store to pick up ingredients for dinner, or perhaps she had stayed late at the clinic to finish a heavy pile of paperwork. He changed out of his work clothes, sat on the couch, and turned on the evening news, completely expecting the front door to open at any second. An hour passed. The sun completely set, plunging the quiet Indiana neighborhood into a heavy, dark chill. By 7 o'clock, the cold seed of confusion had violently mutated into a sharp, heavy spike of pure worry. Owen picked up the heavy plastic landline phone in the kitchen and dialed the medical clinic. The call went entirely straight to the automated after-hours voicemail. He hung up and immediately began dialing the home numbers of Lee's closest friends and family members. No one had seen her. Absolutely no one had spoken to her since the early afternoon. By 9 o'clock that night, Owen was completely consumed by a massive, suffocating panic. He grabbed his coat, jumped into his truck, and began driving wildly through the dark suburban streets. He drove the exact route she usually took home from the clinic. He slowly, aggressively scanned the deep ditches on the side of the rural roads, absolutely terrified that her car had slid off the pavement and crashed into a tree. He drove for hours, his headlights violently cutting through the dark Indiana night, desperately searching for any sign of his wife. He found absolutely nothing. Shortly after midnight, an exhausted, completely terrified Owen Carter walked into the local police precinct and officially filed a highly urgent missing persons report. Because Lee was an adult with absolutely no history of mental illness or substance abuse, the night shift desk sergeant initially tried to calm Owen down, suggesting they had simply gotten into an argument and she was staying at a hotel to cool off. But Owen aggressively, fiercely pushed back. He completely insisted that they were deeply in love, they had not fought, and Lee was absolutely not the kind of person to simply vanish into the night without calling him. The following morning, as the sun slowly rose over the freezing town, the massive, highly terrifying reality of the situation completely set in. A local patrol officer, conducting a routine sweep of the commercial districts, entirely discovered Lee's vehicle. Her small, dark blue sedan was sitting quietly in the massive asphalt parking lot of a local grocery store, located less than 5 miles away from the Carter house. Heavily armed officers immediately secured the area, wrapping the vehicle in thick yellow crime scene tape. Owen was completely aggressively rushed to the scene by a senior detective. He stood shivering in the freezing morning air, completely paralyzed by a profound, suffocating terror as he stared at his wife's abandoned car. The state crime scene technicians carefully, meticulously approached the vehicle. The car was entirely locked. The keys were absolutely not in the ignition. But sitting perfectly visible right on the passenger seat was Lee's leather purse. The police unlocked the car and carefully processed the interior. They found her wallet, her identification, and her credit card still completely tucked inside the purse. There was absolutely no blood. There were no signs of a violent, chaotic struggle. The heavy steering wheel and the door handles were aggressively dusted for fingerprints, but they found absolutely no prints that did not belong to Lee or Owen. But when the lead investigator, a deeply experienced man named Detective Harris, heavily examined the contents of the car, he immediately noticed a massive, highly suspicious detail. He walked over to Owen, who was packing frantically near the edge of the police tape. "Mr. Carter," Detective Harris asked quietly, his eyes heavily studying the young husband, "did your wife usually wear her wedding ring every single day?" "Yes," Owen answered immediately, his voice shaking violently. "She absolutely never took it off. She loved it." Detective Harris looked back at the abandoned car. "Her ring is entirely missing. It's not on the floorboards, it's not in her purse, and there is absolutely no sign that it was violently ripped from her hand." The entire psychological profile of the massive investigation instantly pivoted. The police immediately formed a highly specific, deeply devastating theory. They believed that Leah Carter had absolutely not been violently abducted by a random stranger hiding in the dark. A woman who leaves her purse behind but completely removes her wedding ring is sending a massive, highly deliberate message. The investigators completely believed that Leah had chosen to walk away. They assumed the overwhelming pressure of the new marriage, the new house, and the massive adult responsibilities had caused her to suffer a profound psychological break. They entirely believed she had taken her ring off, left the car in a highly public place, and voluntarily disappeared into a new life. Owen completely, fiercely rejected the entire theory. He knew his wife's heart. He knew the absolute, profound love they shared was completely genuine, but the detectives were heavily seasoned, entirely used to grieving husbands who could not accept the painful reality of a broken marriage. A deeply broken, entirely exhausted Owen was gently sent back to his empty house, while the police began treating the case as a voluntary disappearance. Owen walked through the front door of their small home, the heavy, suffocating silence completely crushing his soul. He slowly walked into their shared bedroom. He sat on the edge of the mattress, completely burying his face in his hands, weeping with a raw, agonizing devastation. He looked over at Leah's small wooden vanity table, desperately looking for any piece of her to hold onto. Sitting quietly near the corner of the vanity was a small, delicate ceramic jewelry dish, where Leah kept her cheap earrings and necklaces. Owen slowly reached out and gently touched the ceramic dish. And then his heart completely stopped beating. Sitting perfectly centered at the very bottom of the ceramic dish, entirely untouched, was Leah's diamond wedding ring. She had absolutely never been wearing it on the day she vanished. Owen realized with a massive, terrifying clarity that Leah had taken the ring off the previous night while painting the living room to avoid getting harsh chemicals on the diamond. She had placed it in the dish and had simply forgotten to put it back on her finger when she rushed out the door to the clinic that morning. The massive, entirely confident police theory completely collapsed in a matter of seconds. Owen aggressively grabbed the ring and drove directly back to the precinct, slamming it onto Detective Harris's desk. Leah had not taken her ring off to abandon her marriage. She had simply left it at home. She was absolutely not running away from him. The detectives were completely forced to completely reevaluate the entire timeline of her disappearance. If she had not voluntarily run away to escape her husband, then what had she been doing during the hours between leaving the clinic and her car being abandoned at the grocery store? Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Detective Harris aggressively launched a massive, highly detailed forensic audit of Leah's life. He completely tore into her employment records, her daily habits, and her heavily restricted financial accounts. Within 48 hours, the financial investigators uncovered a massive, completely terrifying anomaly. On the exact day she vanished, during her brief 30-minute lunch break, Leah had quietly visited a local bank branch. She had stepped up to the teller counter and deliberately withdrawn exactly $800 in pure cash from her personal savings account. The money was absolutely nowhere to be found. It was not in her abandoned purse, and it was not hidden inside her vehicle. The local authorities heavily immediately leaned back into the runaway theory. $800 in 1998 was a significant amount of untraceable cash. It was more than enough to completely buy a bus ticket across the country and secure a cheap motel room for weeks. They entirely assumed she was secretly funding her own escape. But Detective Harris absolutely refused to make another massive assumption. He aggressively demanded that the bank manager immediately turn over the heavy analog security surveillance tapes from that specific afternoon. The technicians at the precinct spent hours running the grainy, black-and-white VHS tape through massive, state-of-the-art digital filters, completely isolating the camera angle pointing directly at the teller counter. When Detective Harris and Owen finally sat in the dark observation room and watched the enhanced footage, the entire narrative of a woman happily running away to a new life was violently, permanently shattered. The footage clearly showed Lee standing at the counter, waiting for the teller to count the heavy stack of cash. But Lee did not look like a woman who was bravely escaping a bad marriage. She looked absolutely, profoundly terrified. Her shoulders were heavily hunched. Her hands were trembling violently as she signed the withdrawal slip. But the most completely chilling, undeniably horrifying detail was her eyes. Every few seconds, Lee would aggressively, frantically glance over her shoulder toward the heavy glass doors of the bank lobby. She was constantly looking behind her, her face completely pale with raw, absolute panic. She was entirely acting like someone who completely believed they were being actively hunted. When the teller finally handed her the cash, Lee aggressively shoved the money into her purse and practically sprinted out of the bank. Detective Harris paused the surveillance video, the heavy silence completely swallowing the dark room. Leah Carter was absolutely not running away from her life. She was desperately, violently running away from a massive, terrifying shadow that had been entirely invisible to everyone around her. And whoever that shadow belonged to, they had completely caught up to her before the sun went down. The massive, terrifying revelation of the bank surveillance footage completely changed the entire trajectory of the investigation. Detective Harris stood in the dark observation room, watching the grainy VHS tape loop over and over again. He watched Leah Carter's profoundly terrified eyes constantly darting toward the heavy glass doors. He watched her trembling hands shove the $800 into her purse. She was not a deeply unhappy bride secretly funding a new life in another state. She was a deeply desperate woman who was completely convinced her life was in absolute, immediate danger. Detective Harris aggressively mobilized a massive, highly energized task force. The state police completely abandoned the runaway theory and instantly launched a full-scale criminal investigation. The detectives entirely realized that to understand exactly what happened in the grocery store parking lot, they had to aggressively reconstruct every single minute of Lee's final hours. Harris immediately drove back to the busy medical clinic where Lee worked. He ordered his deputies to completely separate every single employee and conduct highly intense, isolated interviews. They desperately needed to know exactly what had triggered Lee's massive panic between the morning hours and her sudden afternoon departure. During the grueling interviews, a quiet, deeply observant coworker named Clara finally provided the massive, terrifying missing piece of the timeline. Clara had been sitting at the desk directly across from Lee all morning. She told Detective Harris that Lee had been completely normal until shortly before her lunch break. The phone on her desk rang, Clara explained, her voice trembling heavily as she remembered the deeply chilling detail. It wasn't a call coming through the main clinic switchboard. It was a direct call to her private extension. When Lee picked up the receiver, she didn't say hello. She just listened. Detective Harris leaned forward, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. He asked Clara exactly how Lee had reacted. Her entire face completely drained of color, Clara whispered, her eyes welling with heavy tears. She looked absolutely, profoundly sick. She sat there in complete silence for almost a full minute, just listening to whoever was on the other end of the line. And then, right before she hung up, she said only one single sentence. Clara took a deep, shaky breath, delivering the terrifying phrase that completely shifted the entire psychological profile of the case. "Lee said, 'I'll come alone,'" Clara recalled. The heavy, suffocating silence completely swallowed the small clinic office. Lee had not left work to run an ordinary personal errand. She had been completely, aggressively summoned. The person on the other end of the phone had completely demanded a highly secret, entirely isolated meeting. And based on her absolute, profound terror at the bank, whoever had called her possessed something massive and terrifying enough to force a happily married woman to empty her savings account and drive directly into the dark. Detective Harris immediately filed an urgent, highly restricted subpoena for the regional telecommunications records. In the autumn of 1998, tracing analog phone lines was a deeply exhausting, highly manual process. The technicians worked through the night, aggressively sorting through thousands of routing logs to isolate the exact incoming call made to Lee's private extension. 48 hours later, they finally secured the massive trace. But when Detective Harris looked at the official origin of the phone call, his desperate hope was violently, entirely crushed. The terrifying phone call had absolutely not come from a residential house, a business office, or a registered cellular phone. The stalker was incredibly intelligent, highly calculated, and entirely invisible. The call had been placed from a heavy public payphone located completely outside an abandoned, deeply dilapidated rural gas station, nearly 15 miles completely outside the city limits. Heavily armed state troopers violently descended on the abandoned gas station. They aggressively dusted the heavy metal payphone receiver for fingerprints. They desperately searched the overgrown weeds and the shattered asphalt for any signs of a dropped receipt, a cigarette butt, or tire tracks. But the brutal, completely unforgiving reality of time had already destroyed everything. Days of heavy autumn rain had completely washed the heavy metal payphone clean. There were absolutely no security cameras operating on the rural highway. The completely invisible phantom who had summoned Lee had left absolutely zero physical evidence behind. The investigation slammed into a massive, heavy brick wall. The detectives had the $800, they had the terrifying phone call, and they had the completely abandoned vehicle. But they were entirely missing the absolute most critical piece of the puzzle. They desperately needed an eyewitness who had actually seen Lee in the grocery store parking lot. Detective Harris ordered his patrol officers to aggressively canvass the massive commercial shopping center surrounding the grocery store. They printed thousands of highly visible missing person flyers featuring Lee's smiling face and handed them to every single cashier, store manager, and delivery driver in the area. After 5 deeply agonizing, exhausting days, a highly nervous, deeply quiet teenage boy walked into the local police precinct. He was a part-time employee at the grocery store, responsible for collecting heavy shopping carts from the sprawling asphalt parking lot. When he sat down in the sterile interrogation room with Detective Harris, the teenager provided the very first undeniable, absolute visual confirmation of Lee's final moments. "I completely remember seeing her car," the teenager stated, his hands shaking slightly on the metal table. "It was parked way out in the very back corner of the lot, completely away from the main entrance and the heavy traffic." Detective Harris leaned in, aggressively demanding every single microscopic detail. He asked if Lee was screaming, fighting, or trying to escape the vehicle. "No," the teenager shook his head firmly. "That's exactly why I didn't think anything was wrong. She wasn't crying. She wasn't fighting anyone. She was just sitting alone in the driver's seat, completely still. She was entirely waiting for someone. The young employee explained that he had pushed a heavy row of shopping carts past her vehicle and briefly glanced over. About 2 minutes later, as he was walking back toward the store, he watched a massive, deeply worn, older dark-colored sedan slowly pull into the parking lot. The dark sedan entirely bypassed the empty parking spaces near the front doors. It drove directly to the dark, isolated back corner of the lot and pulled up directly beside Lee's small car. "I didn't see exactly who was driving the dark car," the teenager explained, completely frustrated by his own memory. "The windows were heavily tinted, and the sun was completely glaring off the windshield. I turned my back for just a few seconds to grab another cart. When I looked back at the corner of the lot, both vehicles were completely sitting there in silence. I assumed they were just two friends meeting up." The teenager had completely unknowingly witnessed the exact moment the phantom arrived. The detectives aggressively pressed the witness, desperate for a license plate number, a specific model, or a distinguishing bumper sticker on the dark sedan. The teenager could not remember the exact license plate, but he possessed a deep, highly specific interest in classic cars. He provided Detective Harris with a massive, highly accurate description of the heavy, distinct body style of the older sedan. The state police immediately launched a massive, entirely exhaustive search of the Regional Department of Motor Vehicles database. They aggressively cross-referenced the teenager's specific vehicle description with hundreds of registered sedans in the county. They slowly eliminated the impossible vehicles until they finally isolated one specific match. The vehicle was an older, heavy dark blue sedan registered to an elderly local man named Arthur Vance. Detective Harris completely believed they had finally completely cracked the entire case wide open. He believed Arthur Vance was either the phantom who had summoned Lee, or he was deeply, entirely connected to the massive criminal operation. A heavy convoy of heavily armed state tactical vehicles aggressively surrounded Arthur Vance's isolated rural home just outside the city limits. They expected a massive, violent confrontation. They kicked the heavy wooden front door completely open, completely prepared to arrest the monster, and finally demand the absolute truth about exactly where Lee Carter was being held. But when the tactical team flooded the quiet house, they did not find a highly calculated criminal mastermind. They found a deeply grieving, entirely exhausted elderly widow sitting alone in her dark living room, completely terrified by the violent police intrusion. Detective Harris aggressively slammed the photograph of the dark sedan onto the kitchen table, demanding to know exactly where Arthur Vance was hiding and who had been driving his vehicle on the afternoon Lee vanished. The elderly widow looked at the photograph, heavily bursting into profound, uncontrollable tears. The massive, terrifying truth completely destroyed the momentum of the entire investigation. "Arthur absolutely couldn't have driven that car," the widow wept, her voice completely cracking with heavy sorrow. "My husband passed away from a severe heart attack exactly 2 months ago." Detective Harris completely froze. He immediately checked the state death records. The widow was telling the absolute, undeniable truth. Arthur Vance had died long before Lee Carter had ever received the terrifying phone call at her desk. "Where is the vehicle right now?" Harris demanded, a heavy, suffocating dread completely washing over him. "I sold it," the widow cried. "Just a few weeks after Arthur died, a man completely answered the small classified ad I placed in the local newspaper. He came to the house, handed me pure cash, and entirely drove the car away." Because the widow was deeply overwhelmed by grief, and the man had offered completely untraceable cash, she had simply handed him the keys. She had absolutely never filed the official state transfer paperwork. She did not write down the man's name, she did not ask for his identification, and she completely never saw him again. The dark sedan had entirely changed hands completely off the grid. It was an invisible ghost car, entirely completely untraceable, driven by a phantom who had intentionally completely purchased a vehicle that technically still belonged to a dead man. The heavy, massive trail completely disappeared into thin air. The brutal, completely unforgiving winter slowly arrived in Indiana. Heavy, thick snow completely buried the quiet suburban neighborhood and the sprawling grocery store parking lot. The massive national media attention eventually shifted to other tragedies. The state detectives were slowly, quietly reassigned to newer, more active violent crimes. Lee Carter officially became one of the most frustrating, profoundly heartbreaking missing person cases in the entire history of the state. Owen Carter was entirely trapped in a massive, relentless purgatory. He completely refused to pack away Lee's clothes. He left her small ceramic jewelry dish sitting perfectly on the vanity, entirely staring at the diamond ring every single night. He was a deeply broken ghost, completely consumed by the massive, unyielding silence that had entirely stolen his beautiful wife. Before we continue, if you want more emotional cold case stories like this, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Months slowly dragged into heavy, agonizing years. Almost everyone completely assumed that the absolute truth had died in the freezing autumn air. But just before the massive state task force was officially completely dissolved, Detective Harris had ordered his junior officers to conduct one final, incredibly tedious forensic audit of Lee's daily movements in the entire month leading up to her disappearance. He desperately wanted to know if she had been heavily changing her routine, completely trying to avoid the phantom who was stalking her. The junior detectives meticulously pulled her daily punch cards from the medical clinic. They completely mapped every single lunch break she had taken for 30 days. When they finally placed the massive timeline on the heavy corkboard in the precinct, they discovered a completely baffling, highly terrifying pattern that entirely defied all human logic. During the weeks leading up to the terrifying phone call, Lee had completely stopped eating lunch with her coworkers. She had entirely stopped running completely normal errands. Instead, she had been repeatedly driving directly to the massive county courthouse in the center of the city. The detectives aggressively subpoenaed the heavy, printed visitor logs from the highly restricted county records department. The logs completely confirmed that Lee had spent dozens of hours sitting entirely alone in the dusty, quiet archives. She had been desperately requesting deep historical birth records and highly restricted family court files. But the most completely terrifying, massive anomaly was exactly whose files she was desperately hunting for. She was absolutely not looking for her own birth certificate. She was aggressively requesting the heavily guarded, highly restricted legal files belonging to someone else entirely. Detective Harris immediately drove to the county courthouse and aggressively demanded the chief clerk pull the exact historical files Lee had been secretly reviewing. He entirely believed those documents held the absolute key to the phantom's true identity. But when the chief clerk returned from the massive basement archives, his face was completely pale with profound shock. The clerk handed Detective Harris an empty, highly restricted manila folder. "I am incredibly sorry, Detective," the clerk whispered, completely terrified. "The official records your victim was heavily researching are entirely gone." Detective Harris aggressively demanded to know exactly who had checked them out. "They weren't checked out," the clerk explained, his voice entirely trembling. "They were permanently removed from public access and placed under a highly classified, heavily restricted federal seal. And the official date they were permanently sealed and physically removed from this building was exactly 2 days after Lee Carter completely vanished." Someone with massive, deeply embedded institutional power had completely realized Lee was digging into the dark. They had aggressively summoned her, violently silenced her, and then systematically entirely erased the exact historical truth she had been desperately trying to uncover. The revelation that someone had deliberately, permanently sealed the historical courthouse records exactly 2 days after Lee vanished completely paralyzed the state task force. The investigation had aggressively slammed into an impenetrable, highly protected institutional wall. And as the massive police effort began to slowly stall, Lee's closest friend, a deeply devastated young woman named Sarah, finally walked into the precinct and admitted a terrifying secret she had hidden for weeks. Lee completely believed someone was actively following her, Sarah wept, sitting across from Detective Harris. For nearly a month before she disappeared, she told me she constantly felt like she was being heavily watched. She absolutely never reported it to the police because she didn't want Owen to worry. She thought she was just being paranoid. The detectives immediately canvassed the Carter neighborhood again, aggressively pushing the residents for any forgotten details. And this time, several neighbors heavily confirmed the terrifying reality. They had completely seen a dark-colored, older sedan parked quietly near the couple's small house on multiple evenings. The engine was always turned off. The headlights were always dark, but because it was a quiet, perfectly safe suburb, absolutely nobody had bothered to write down the license plate. The invisible phantom had been aggressively, silently stalking the young bride right outside her front door. But without a license plate, without the missing courthouse records, and without a single physical piece of evidence from the grocery store parking lot, the massive investigation slowly bled to a complete halt. Years passed. The freezing Indiana winters melted into bright, beautiful summers, completely ignoring the profound, suffocating grief left behind. The heavy newspaper headlines slowly faded. Lee's friends eventually moved on, having children and building the exact lives Lee had so desperately wanted. Even the deeply dedicated investigators, including Detective Harris, eventually retired, taking the massive, heavily unsolved case file with them in their memories. Only Owen Carter absolutely refused to stop wondering exactly what happened to his beautiful wife. 17 deeply agonizing years passed. It was now the late autumn of 2015. Owen was a much older, deeply weathered man in his mid-40s. He had survived the massive, crushing weight of the unknown by completely burying himself in his work. He lived entirely alone in a small, quiet apartment, completely haunted by the endless, unanswered questions of that ordinary Thursday. Then, on a cold, rainy Tuesday afternoon, everything completely changed. Owen's elderly father had recently passed away after a long illness. His father was a deeply organized man who had rented the exact same private post office box at the local municipal building for nearly 4 decades. As the executor of his father's modest estate, Owen drove to the post office to officially close the account and completely clear out the remaining mail. He walked into the brightly lit, completely quiet lobby. He inserted the small brass key into the heavy metal door of the post office box. The box was mostly empty, containing only a few heavily outdated magazines. But as Owen reached his hand all the way to the very back of the narrow metal slot, his fingers brushed against a thick, tightly wedged stack of undelivered mail. It had completely slipped behind a broken metal divider, entirely hidden from the postal workers for years. Owen carefully pulled the heavy stack of letters out into the light. Most of them were simple, unimportant flyers. But sitting at the very bottom of the stack was a single, unopened white envelope. It was heavily yellowed with extreme age, the edges slightly curled. Owen flipped the envelope over, and his entire heart completely stopped beating in his chest. It was addressed directly to Owen Carter. And the familiar, beautiful handwriting belonging to the sender completely shattered his soul. It was from Lee. Owen's hands began to shake with a massive, uncontrollable violence. He stared at the faded black ink of the official postmark stamped heavily across the top right corner. The postmark was dated October 15, 1998. It was the absolute exact day. She had completely vanished from the grocery store parking lot. Owen could not breathe. He practically completely ran out of the quiet lobby, retreating into the heavy safety of his truck. He locked the doors, his chest heaving with massive, shallow breaths. For 17 agonizing years, he had completely believed she was gone forever. And for 17 years, her final words to him had been completely sitting inside a dark metal box just a few miles away. He carefully, desperately tore the heavy envelope open. He pulled out a single piece of lined notebook paper. The letter was absolutely not a cruel goodbye. It was not a confession of a deeply unhappy marriage. It was a profound, entirely completely desperate apology. "My beautiful Owen," Lee's frantic, heavily smudged handwriting echoed off the page. "I am so incredibly sorry that I haven't told you what is happening. For the last few weeks, someone has been secretly contacting me. They claim they know the absolute truth about my childhood. They told me the adoption records my parents gave me are completely fake." Owen read the words, thick, heavy tears openly, entirely, completely spilling down his weathered face. Lee explained in the letter that the anonymous caller had demanded a highly secret meeting. She was completely terrified, but she was fiercely determined to uncover the truth. "I am meeting them tonight after work," Lee wrote, her handwriting completely shaking near the bottom of the page. "I promise you, I will come straight home the second it is over. I will sit down with you and I will explain absolutely everything." But it was the absolute final, completely devastating sentence of the letter that entirely shattered everything Owen had ever believed. "Owen," Lee wrote, concluding her final message to the world, "if this person is telling the truth, then my entire life has been a complete lie." Owen completely broke down inside his truck, weeping with a raw, agonizing devastation. The massive, beautiful relief violently collided with absolute, profound heartbreak. Lee had never abandoned him. She had never stopped loving him. Her final, absolute thoughts had been entirely, completely focused on coming home to him. She had simply been a desperate young woman trying to uncover her true identity, and she had walked directly into a massive, terrifying trap. Owen immediately drove his truck at 80 miles an hour directly to the state police headquarters. He slammed the highly preserved, heavily yellowed letter directly onto the front desk. The State Cold Case Division immediately, violently reopened the entire investigation. The massive, undeniable physical evidence of the letter completely, fundamentally altered the entire reality of the case. Federal postal investigators were aggressively brought in to explain the massive 17-year delay. They quickly confirmed a deeply tragic, entirely simple human error. Owen and his late father shared the exact same first initial and last name. A highly rushed postal worker in 1998 had accidentally slipped the crucial letter into the father's rented box instead of delivering it to the Carter home. The broken metal divider had completely swallowed it, entirely hiding the absolute path to justice for nearly 2 decades. A highly aggressive, deeply experienced cold case investigator named Detective Vance took complete control of the new investigation. Vance immediately returned to the massive county courthouse archives. With the massive authority of a newly reopened homicide investigation, he completely bypassed the local clerks and secured a highly powerful federal warrant to unseal the visitor logs from 1998. Vance desperately needed to know exactly whose restricted birth records Lee had been researching before the corrupt officials permanently sealed them. The highly restricted logs revealed Lee had been aggressively tracking a woman named Clara Miller. According to the official state registries from 1998, Clara Miller had been listed as completely deceased for over 20 years. But when Detective Vance ran the historical name through the newly modernized, highly advanced national federal databases, he discovered a massive, completely terrifying impossibility. Clara Miller was absolutely not dead. Her original death certificate had been highly officially issued by complete mistake after a massive, deeply suspicious identity mix-up decades before. The woman was still completely alive. She was currently living a deeply quiet, highly isolated life under a completely different legal name in a small rural town in Ohio. Detective Vance and Owen immediately drove across the state line. They arrived at a small, heavily worn farmhouse, sitting quietly at the end of a long gravel road. When Detective Vance knocked on the door and showed the elderly woman the fading photograph of Lee Carter, the woman completely broke down. She covered her face with her trembling hands and wept with a heavy, profound guilt that had entirely consumed her for decades. She invited them into her quiet kitchen. She admitted the massive, completely horrifying truth about the adoption network. "I was a young nurse in the early 1970s, the elderly woman confessed, her voice heavily cracking. "I worked at a private, highly exclusive maternity home here in the Midwest. The facility handled incredibly expensive, highly secretive private adoptions for wealthy families." She looked directly at Owen, delivering the absolute devastating reality of Lee's entire existence. "Lee's birth records were completely, entirely forged," the woman whispered. "The network illegally altered the names of the biological mothers, heavily completely falsified the medical documents, and sold the infants to families who completely believed the process was entirely legal." Owen sat entirely, completely frozen. Lee had absolutely discovered that the entire foundation of her family was a massive, highly illegal criminal deception. Before we continue, if you want more emotional cold case stories like this, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. But the elderly nurse fiercely, aggressively insisted that she had absolutely never contacted Lee. She had been completely hiding in Ohio for years, entirely terrified of the highly powerful network. "I didn't call her," the woman cried. But someone else inside the agency was heavily, aggressively searching those exact same historical files just a few weeks before that beautiful young girl disappeared. Detective Vance aggressively demanded a name. The woman provided the exact identity of the senior records clerk who had controlled the highly secretive adoption files in the 1970s. His name was Thomas. The massive, highly energized investigation aggressively pivoted back to Indiana, directly targeting the retired records clerk. But the deeply suffocating, entirely relentless cruelty of time violently struck the case once again. When Detective Vance arrived at the retired clerk's last known address, he discovered that Thomas had died of a severe stroke just 6 months earlier. The man had completely entirely escaped questioning, taking his massive, deeply dark secrets directly to the grave. But Detective Vance completely refused to let the trail go cold again. He aggressively audited the deceased man's financial estate. He discovered that Thomas had heavily maintained a highly secure, climate-controlled storage unit on the dark industrial edge of the city. Armed with a massive search warrant, the state police violently cut the heavy steel padlock off the storage unit. The space was completely filled with dozens of heavy, highly organized cardboard boxes. The detectives spent hours entirely meticulously tearing through the dusty files. Deeply hidden in the very back corner, completely entirely buried under heavy furniture, they found the massive, deeply guarded historical archives of the illegal adoption network. There were hundreds of highly detailed, entirely illegal files documenting exactly how the infants were completely erased and resold. But when Detective Vance opened the heavy master index, his blood completely ran cold. Lee Carter's specific, highly detailed individual folder was completely missing from the box. It was the absolute only file that had been completely entirely removed. The phantom had violently completely eliminated the young bride, and then deliberately destroyed her specific history to completely protect the massive network. But criminals who operate completely in the dark always entirely miss one single, highly microscopic detail. While carefully sorting through a different, unrelated file from the 1970s, Detective Vance found a small, heavily faded color photograph. It was a casual picture completely taken during a summer picnic on the wide front lawn of the secret maternity home. Dozens of nurses and doctors were smiling at the camera. But Detective Vance completely ignored the doctors. His highly trained eyes were entirely locked on the deep background of the photograph. Standing quietly near a heavy oak tree, completely wearing a young volunteer uniform, was a highly familiar, entirely terrifying face. Vance's heart violently pounded against his ribs. He completely recognized the young man instantly. It was absolutely not a random medical student. It was a man who had grown up to become a deeply respected, highly decorated local police officer. In fact, it was the exact, absolute specific police officer who had been the very first person to officially respond to Lee's abandoned vehicle in the grocery store parking lot 17 years earlier. The massive, undeniable realization that the first responding police officer was deeply, personally connected to the illegal adoption network completely shattered the trust of the state task force. Detective Vance stood in the dusty, quiet storage unit, staring at the old photograph. The young man smiling in the background of the 1970s maternity home picnic was an officer named William Davies. Officer Davies was a highly respected, deeply decorated veteran of the local police department. He had recently retired with a massive, honorable pension. But 17 years earlier, on the freezing morning they discovered Lee's abandoned vehicle, Davies had been the absolute first person to secure the grocery store parking lot. He had been the one to initially interview the witnesses. He had been the one to write the highly influential preliminary report that aggressively steered the entire department toward the theory that Lee had simply run away. Detective Vance furiously realized that Davies had absolutely not been conducting a standard investigation. He had been completely managing a massive, terrifying cover-up from the very first second. Heavily armed state police completely surrounded the retired officer's sprawling suburban home. They did not want to trigger a massive, violent standoff. Detective Vance calmly walked up to the front door, knocked heavily, and asked the retired officer to come down to the precinct to consult on an old cold case. When Davies sat down in the sterile interrogation room, he looked completely relaxed, entirely unaware that the massive walls of his decades-long deception were about to violently collapse. Detective Vance sat across the metal table and slowly, quietly slid the faded photograph of the maternity home picnic completely across the surface. Davies looked at the photograph. His completely relaxed demeanor entirely evaporated. His face turned a deeply pale, sickly shade of gray. "I don't completely remember this," the retired officer lied, his voice completely shaking. "I attended a lot of community events back in the 70s. I have absolutely no idea what this facility is." Detective Vance did not raise his voice. He simply opened a thick, heavily detailed manila folder and completely destroyed the man's lie. "We pulled the original, highly restricted volunteer logs from the state archives," Vance stated, his voice completely cold and unyielding. "You didn't just attend a single picnic, William. You actively volunteered at that specific, highly secretive maternity home every single weekend for nearly 3 entire years. You completely knew the doctors. You entirely knew the records clerks. And you absolutely knew exactly who Lee Carter was the second you saw her name on the dispatch radio." The retired officer sat in absolute, completely deafening silence. Vance aggressively pressed the massive advantage, throwing the highly restricted, completely audited financial records onto the table. We pulled your banking history from the autumn of 1998, Vance continued, his eyes completely locked on the broken man. Exactly 3 days after Lee vanished, you began making a series of completely unexplained, highly suspicious cash deposits into a private savings account. It was absolutely not enough money to prove a massive criminal payoff in court, but it is more than enough to prove you were quietly bought. The retired officer completely broke. He buried his face in his heavily wrinkled hands, weeping with a profound, terrifying shame. He finally admitted the deeply horrifying truth. He confessed that on the morning Lee disappeared, someone deeply powerful inside the adoption network had immediately contacted him. They completely panicked, Davies wept, his voice cracking violently in the quiet room. They told me Lee was aggressively digging into the historical adoption records. They asked me to completely secure the vehicle and quietly, heavily discourage the other detectives from looking into her past. They told me that if the illegal adoptions were exposed, it would completely destroy dozens of completely innocent families in the community. They entirely convinced me I was protecting children. You were protecting monsters, Vance fired back, completely disgusted. Who entirely paid you? I absolutely never met them in person, Davies cried. The money was simply mailed to my house in heavy envelopes, but they told me I wasn't the only person they had silenced. They told me they had completely shut down an investigative reporter who was entirely getting too close to Lee's biological mother. The massive, terrifying admission completely opened an entirely new, highly desperate path for the state task force. If a journalist had been aggressively investigating the adoption network years earlier, they might possess the absolute, undeniable physical proof of Lee's true origins. Detective Vance immediately heavily audited the local media archives from the 1990s. They found the name of an independent investigative journalist who had completely vanished from the industry shortly before Lee's disappearance. When state police completely tracked the former journalist down, he was living a deeply quiet, highly paranoid life in a neighboring state. He completely admitted that he had heavily investigated the maternity home in the 90s, but he had aggressively dropped the story after receiving massive, highly terrifying threats against his family. But he had entirely refused to destroy his evidence. The journalist handed Detective Vance a heavy, dusty cardboard box. Inside was a single, completely forgotten audio cassette tape. It was a highly secretive, completely unaired interview the journalist had conducted in 1997 with Lee's true biological mother. Vance and Owen sat in the completely quiet command center, staring at the old analog tape player. The heavy, crackling static filled the room, followed by the profoundly heartbreaking, deeply fragile voice of a woman who had completely lost her child. On the tape, the biological mother heavily explained that she had been forced to surrender her baby at the corrupt maternity home. She wept as she described how she had spent decades entirely, desperately searching for her daughter. But the most completely terrifying detail on the tape was a severe warning. "Someone called me last week," the biological mother's voice echoed through the dark room. A deeply cold, highly terrifying voice. "They completely ordered me to entirely stop looking for my baby. They told me that my daughter was finally starting to ask questions, and if I didn't stay completely silent, they would make sure I never, ever saw her again." Owen completely broke down, his heavy tears openly spilling over his weathered cheeks. Lee had absolutely not been alone in her search. Her true mother had been desperately looking for her for 26 years. The state police immediately aggressively used the highly restricted details on the tape to track down the biological mother. They found her living quietly in a small town just outside Indianapolis. She was now a deeply exhausted, entirely heartbroken woman in her late 60s. When Detective Vance and Owen walked into her small living room, they carefully explained the massive, completely overwhelming reality of the reopened investigation. They quietly arranged for an immediate, highly expedited DNA test to absolutely confirm her identity. 48 hours later, the flawless scientific results returned. The biological connection was completely undeniable. When Detective Vance gently told the mother that Lee had completely vanished while trying to find her, the woman collapsed onto her living room floor, weeping with a raw, agonizing, completely profound devastation. "I thought she completely hated me," the mother cried, completely gasping for air. "I thought she had found out who I was and simply entirely rejected me. I spent 17 years completely believing my beautiful daughter didn't want me." Owen slowly knelt on the floor next to her, completely wrapping his arms around the deeply broken woman. They completely held each other, weeping with a massive, shared agony. "She absolutely never rejected you," Owen whispered, his voice completely cracking. "She was coming to find you. She was completely willing to risk absolutely everything just to know who you were." The deeply profound, highly emotional reunion heavily fueled Detective Vance's absolute determination to entirely destroy the network. He violently ordered the state task force to entirely reevaluate every single witness statement from 1998. They needed to heavily look at the evidence with completely fresh, completely unbiased eyes. While reviewing the massive, thick binders of old interviews, Vance heavily realized a deeply terrifying, completely ignored detail about the grocery store parking lot. Because the corrupt officer had aggressively steered the initial investigation, the police had completely assumed the grocery store was the exact location where Lee was violently abducted. But Vance completely realized that absolutely made no logical sense. Lee was highly intelligent. She was entirely terrified of the shadow following her. She would absolutely never allow herself to be cornered in a massive, highly visible parking lot in broad daylight. The parking lot was absolutely not an abduction site. It was a highly calculated transfer point. Lee had completely deliberately driven her own car to that specific grocery store. She had deliberately removed her keys, entirely locked the doors, and completely left her purse behind. She had completely walked away from her own vehicle to get into another car. She entirely believed she was getting into a completely safe vehicle driven by someone she was fully convinced she could completely trust to help her expose the adoption network. The invisible phantom had not violently dragged her away. They had entirely manipulated her into voluntarily stepping into the dark. Detective Vance immediately completely authorized a massive, highly aggressive new media campaign. The state police released entirely new details about the dark sedan seen in the parking lot, directly begging the public for any deeply forgotten memories. The massive media blitz completely blanketed the state. 3 days later, an incredibly elderly, heavily fragile man slowly walked into the local police precinct. He was incredibly nervous, his hands completely trembling as he sat across from Detective Vance. He heavily explained that he had been standing near the edge of the grocery store parking lot on that exact Thursday afternoon in 1998, waiting for a local bus. He completely admitted that he had absolutely seen Lee Carter. "I was entirely too afraid to completely speak up back then," the elderly man whispered, his voice filled with a heavy, profound shame. "I completely knew the police were heavily involved in the corruption in this town. I was entirely terrified they would completely destroy my family if I became a witness." Detective Vance gently placed his hand on the table, completely urging the man to explain exactly what he saw. "I saw the young woman," the witness stated firmly. "I saw her completely willingly walk away from her small blue car. She walked directly over to the massive, highly dark sedan that had pulled into the back corner." "Who was driving the dark sedan?" Vance asked, his heart completely pounding a frantic rhythm. "Was it a man?" The elderly witness completely shook his head, delivering the absolute, massive, terrifying detail that completely changed the entire direction of the case. "It was absolutely not a man," the witness whispered. "It was a middle-aged woman. She had dark hair and she was wearing a heavy professional coat. The young bride completely leaned down, spoke to the woman through the passenger window, and then she entirely, completely, willingly opened the door and climbed inside. The car simply drove away. The phantom driving the dark sedan was a woman." The massive revelation completely sent the entire state task force aggressively scrambling through decades-old employment records. Detective Vance entirely realized that the woman driving the car absolutely had to be deeply connected to the old county courthouse or the original maternity home. Lee completely trusted her enough to get into the vehicle, meaning the woman had completely convinced Lee she was an ally. Vance aggressively audited the heavily restricted historical tax records for every single female employee who had worked inside the county archives and the adoption agency during the 1990s. He meticulously cross-referenced the names against missing persons databases and completely sudden, highly suspicious resignations. He finally completely isolated a massive, undeniable match. Her name was Eleanor. She had been a highly senior administrative coordinator working directly alongside the corrupt records clerk inside the massive adoption agency. And most terrifyingly, Eleanor had entirely vanished from the state of Indiana just 3 weeks after Lee Carter disappeared. She had entirely quietly abandoned her house, completely emptied her bank accounts, and completely dropped off the federal grid. State police aggressively launched a massive, highly advanced digital manhunt. They completely traced entirely hidden Social Security hits, highly restricted medical records, and completely forgotten utility bills across the country. They finally located the phantom. Eleanor was currently living completely, under a highly falsified identity, in a deeply isolated retirement community in the mountains of North Carolina. Heavily armed federal marshals and state police completely surrounded the quiet mountain cabin. Detective Vance and Owen stood on the front porch as the heavily armed officers kicked the heavy wooden door completely open. They found Eleanor sitting quietly in her kitchen, entirely expecting them. She looked profoundly exhausted, carrying the massive, heavy weight of a terrible secret for 17 years. If you want more emotional cold case stories like this, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. When Detective Vance violently slammed the faded photograph of Lee Carter directly onto her kitchen table, Eleanor completely broke down. She openly wept, her entire body shaking with a heavy, agonizing terror. "I didn't hurt her," Eleanor cried, her voice cracking violently in the quiet cabin. "I completely swear to you, I absolutely never wanted to hurt that beautiful girl. I was just completely terrified for my own life." Detective Vance aggressively demanded the absolute, undeniable truth about the grocery store parking lot. Eleanor completely confessed the terrifying, highly calculated deception. "The network was completely falling apart," Eleanor wept. "Lee was aggressively asking entirely too many questions. She had completely uncovered the forged documents. I was entirely ordered to contact her. I called her at the medical clinic. I completely lied to her. I entirely promised her that if she met me alone in the parking lot, I would completely hand over the absolute original, highly protected birth records that would finally prove exactly who her biological mother was." Owen stood in the corner of the small kitchen, his entire body trembling violently with a raw, agonizing rage. Lee had completely walked into the trap because she entirely believed she was finally getting the truth. "She got into your car," Vance stated, his voice completely cold. "Exactly where did you take her?" "I didn't take her anywhere," Eleanor choked out, completely gasping for heavy air. I completely promised the network I would just drive her to a quiet diner to completely talk her out of going to the police. But the second she got into my car, everything completely changed. Eleanor looked directly into Owen's deeply hollow, completely devastated eyes. "A highly powerful man suddenly arrived," Eleanor whispered, her voice filled with absolute, complete terror. "He was entirely not supposed to be there. He aggressively pulled his own vehicle completely behind mine, entirely trapping us in the corner of the lot. He violently opened the passenger door. He entirely told Lee that she had to come with him to a heavily secure, completely safe location to protect the documents." "Who was the man?" Vance demanded, entirely pressing the massive advantage. "He was the man completely in charge of everything," Eleanor cried. "Lee entirely trusted him because of his highly respected title in the community. She willingly got out of my car and completely stepped into his vehicle. He drove away with her. I was so completely terrified that I completely packed my bags and vanished. I absolutely never, ever saw Lee Carter again." The massive, completely overwhelming realization violently washed over the entire investigation. The middle-aged woman had absolutely not harmed Lee. She had simply, completely cowardly handed the young bride directly over to a massive, highly powerful monster who was completely hiding in plain sight. And for the absolute first time in 17 agonizing years, the state police finally had a credible, undeniable eyewitness who completely knew the exact identity of the man who had driven Lee Carter entirely into the dark. The massive, suffocating silence completely swallowed the small mountain cabin. Detective Vance leaned heavily across the wooden kitchen table, his eyes locked entirely on the terrified woman sitting in front of him. For 17 agonizing years, the state police had been chasing a completely invisible ghost. Now, they finally had an eyewitness who completely knew the exact identity of the monster who had taken Lee Carter. "Who was the man in the parking lot?" Detective Vance demanded, his voice dropping into a deeply cold, unyielding whisper. "Who did she get into the car with?" Eleanor violently trembled, heavy tears spilling over her deeply wrinkled cheeks. She took a highly ragged, desperate breath, completely preparing to expose the absolute highest level of corruption in the state of Indiana. "His name is Elias Caldwell," Eleanor cried, completely defeated. "He was a highly prominent, incredibly powerful former family court attorney. He had quietly managed absolutely all the legal paperwork for the adoption network for decades. He was the one who heavily falsified the identities, heavily bribed the local judges, and completely sealed the historical records to protect the wealthy families who bought the stolen children." Owen stood in the corner of the cabin, his mind completely reeling from the massive, overwhelming revelation. Elias Caldwell was absolutely not a random, violent drifter. He was a deeply respected, highly educated pillar of the local community. He was a man who completely walked through the county courthouse in expensive suits, entirely shaking hands with the exact police officers who were supposedly desperately searching for Lee. Detective Vance did not waste a single second. He immediately contacted the massive state police command center in Indiana. Within hours, a heavy convoy of heavily armed state tactical vehicles aggressively completely surrounded Elias Caldwell's massive, sprawling estate on the deeply wealthy edge of the city. The state troopers violently kicked the heavy mahogany front doors completely open, flooding the massive mansion with heavily armed officers. They did not find Caldwell attempting to run. The former attorney was now a deeply elderly man in his late 70s. He was sitting quietly in his massive, deeply expensive private study, holding a glass of water. He looked completely calm, completely expecting them. Caldwell had completely known that his massive, decades-long deception was entirely collapsing the exact moment the retired police officer was arrested. Heavily armed officers aggressively placed the former attorney in heavy steel handcuffs and drove him directly to the state police precinct. Owen Carter stood in the dark observation room, his hands completely pressed fiercely against the two-way glass. He stared with a raw, agonizing, completely profound rage at the elderly man sitting calmly in the sterile interrogation room. This was the monster who had completely stolen his beautiful wife, entirely destroyed their future, and forced him to live in a suffocating purgatory for 17 years. Detective Vance walked into the interrogation room, carrying a massive, incredibly thick stack of highly restricted financial transactions, old property deeds, and the completely heavily documented confession from a leaner. Vance slammed the heavy files directly onto the metal table. "We completely have absolutely everything, Elias," Vance stated, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. "We have the corrupt records clerk. We have the bribed police officer. We have the terrified woman from the parking lot. We completely know exactly how you heavily falsified the adoptions, and we entirely completely know that you were the absolute last person to ever see Lee Carter alive." Caldwell stared at the files, his completely arrogant, deeply cold facade finally beginning to slowly crack. Faced with massive, absolutely overwhelming, undeniable physical evidence, the former attorney finally broke. He entirely surrendered to the massive weight of the truth. "She was entirely too smart for her own good," Caldwell whispered, his voice completely devoid of any genuine human emotion. Lee had completely uncovered deeply hidden, highly restricted documents that perfectly connected several entirely fraudulent adoptions to people who still held highly respected positions in the community. She was entirely going to destroy the entire system. Caldwell admitted the deeply horrifying, absolute final truth about exactly what happened after Lee willingly stepped into his vehicle in the grocery store parking lot. "I completely lied to her," Caldwell confessed, staring entirely at the cold metal table. "I told her I was a highly safe, entirely confidential legal advocate who completely wanted to help her securely expose the network. I simply told her we needed to drive to a highly secure secondary location to safely review the original birth files." Owen closed his eyes in the dark observation room, weeping with a heavy, profound agony. Lee had completely believed she was finally getting the absolute truth she had so desperately sought. Caldwell heavily explained that he had driven Lee to a deeply remote, highly isolated property entirely owned by the corrupt adoption network. He completely admitted that he originally only wanted to heavily persuade her to stay silent. He offered her massive amounts of untraceable cash, completely promising to privately connect her with her biological mother if she entirely walked away and burned her evidence. "But she completely refused," Caldwell whispered, heavily shaking his head. "During the confrontation in the remote house, she completely realized the massive, terrifying scope of the deception. She completely realized that I was absolutely not trying to help her. She told me she was going directly back to her husband, and then they were going completely straight to the federal authorities." The former attorney completely realized he absolutely could not let her leave the property alive. He unlawfully, violently held her entirely against her will. For several terrifying days, he aggressively moved the terrified young bride between completely remote, deeply isolated properties owned by the network, desperately trying to figure out exactly how to completely permanently silence her without drawing a massive police investigation. "She was incredibly brave," Caldwell whispered, a tiny, fleeting trace of heavy regret in his voice. "She absolutely never stopped fighting me. One evening, when I opened the door to bring her food, she aggressively fought back. She completely, entirely broke past me and ran wildly into the dark woods, desperately trying to escape." Caldwell took a deep, heavy breath, delivering the absolute final, deeply tragic conclusion to Lee's life. "I chased her into the dark," Caldwell confessed. "In the massive, chaotic struggle to completely drag her back to the cabin, she heavily fell, She suffered a deeply massive, completely fatal injury. She lost her life entirely right there in the freezing woods. The entire precinct fell into absolute, deafening silence. The former attorney heavily admitted that he had completely concealed what happened, burying her remains deeply on the isolated property. He then spent the next 17 years completely aggressively destroying highly historical records, heavily bribing local officials, and erasing entirely every single microscopic trace of her massive investigation. In the dark observation room, Owen Carter completely collapsed onto the floor. The massive, beautiful hope he had carried for decades was entirely completely extinguished. His beautiful, gentle wife had absolutely not been a helpless victim. She had been a highly intelligent, fiercely courageous protector who completely entirely fought back against a massive monster until her absolute final breath. 2 days later, heavily armed state police and forensic recovery teams aggressively descended on the deeply remote, heavily wooded property Caldwell had explicitly described in his confession. After several hours of meticulously searching the freezing ground, they finally found her. They gently recovered the tragic, deeply preserved remains of 26-year-old Leah Carter. Owen was completely allowed to heavily approach the quiet, highly secured excavation site. He fell to his knees in the cold dirt, completely breaking down with a raw, agonizing, deeply profound devastation that entirely completely echoed through the quiet forest. The 17 years of suffocating purgatory were finally over, but the massive, profound emotional cost was entirely unmeasurable. The highly publicized federal trial of Elias Caldwell completely captivated the entire nation. The massive, deeply undeniable evidence completely exposed the entire, terrifying scope of the illegal adoption network. Caldwell was overwhelmingly convicted of massive federal charges, highly organized corruption, and the tragic death of Leah Carter. The judge sentenced the former attorney to multiple consecutive life sentences in a heavily secure federal prison, completely ensuring he would absolutely never walk free again. But the massive, highly powerful truth absolutely did not stop with Caldwell. The entire corrupt network was entirely completely torn down from the inside out. Corrupt records clerks, heavily bribed medical officials, and deeply corrupt local authorities were aggressively indicted and sent to federal prison. Because of Lee's profound bravery, dozens of completely stolen, highly falsified adoption records were finally permanently unsealed. Entire families who had lived with the agonizing, deeply painful uncertainty of completely stolen children were finally beautifully reunited. On a bright, quiet morning in early spring, Owen Carter completely arranged a profoundly moving, deeply beautiful memorial service for his wife. He carefully laid Leah to rest in the soft green earth of the quiet Indiana cemetery, placing a stunning, heavy marble headstone over her grave that entirely permanently declared the massive truth of her beautiful life to the world. Standing quietly directly beside Owen at the cemetery was an elderly, deeply exhausted woman. It was Leah's completely true, entirely biological mother. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the quiet sunlight, entirely completely bonded by a massive, deeply shared tragedy. The mother completely wept, gently holding Owen's weathered hand. She had entirely lost her beautiful daughter to a massive, highly corrupt system, but she had absolutely finally found the truth. She completely knew that Leah had spent her absolute final days desperately, fiercely fighting to come back to the people she completely loved. When Owen completely returned to his quiet apartment later that evening, he walked over to the small table and heavily looked at the highly yellowed, completely preserved unopened letter. The letter had been entirely delayed for 17 agonizing years by a completely simple, entirely innocent postal sorting error. But it had ultimately become the absolute single, completely undeniable piece of evidence that redirected the entire state investigation. It completely entirely proved that Lee Carter had absolutely never abandoned her husband. She had absolutely never run away because she was unhappy, and she had entirely never been hiding a dark, secret double life. She was simply a beautiful, deeply honest woman who was entirely desperately trying to uncover the absolute truth about her own past. And because one ordinary, highly innocent letter absolutely never reached the person it was meant for, the massive path to justice had remained entirely completely hidden in the dark for nearly 2 entire decades. In the absolute end, Owen completely finally learned the most deeply beautiful, profoundly important truth of his entire life. Lee's final, absolute thoughts had absolutely not been about leaving him. They had completely, entirely been about coming home, sitting down at their small kitchen table, and telling him absolutely everything. The massive, highly terrifying mystery of Lee Carter was finally entirely completely resolved. The truth absolutely brought massive, highly overdue convictions, beautifully reunited deeply broken biological families with the lives they had completely lost, and finally entirely closed one of Indiana's longest-running, most profoundly frustrating cold cases. It provided a deeply heartbreaking but entirely completely satisfying sense of absolute justice, completely leaving the world with the beautiful, highly profound realization that a single, hidden truth can absolutely never stay buried forever. And true love completely absolutely never stops fighting to find its way home.